Mahona Bay on the south shore of Nova Scotia holds roughly 360 islands. Most are spruce, granite, cobble beach, and gulls. One of them is 140 acres, sits 200 meters offshore, and rises about 11 meters above the sea. It is not big. It is not dramatic. People have been digging holes in it for more than 2 centuries and have never found anything. This is the story of the searchers, not the treasure. A company that watched the water in a fresh shaft rise and fall with the tide, and realized they were trying to pump out the Atlantic. A future president of the United States spending a summer holiday there with a drill rig. A California geologist who barged a 70-ton crane across a purpose-built causeway and dug a crater 100 feet wide. And a man who lived on that island with his family for 6 years, climbed down a 27-foot shaft on a warm August afternoon and did not come back up. Stick with us to the end because that one is number 1. If you like these deep dives into places that quietly refuse to explain themselves, hit subscribe. We post a story like this every week. Today, we are counting down 10 expeditions the Oak Island Money Pit defeated. Number 10. The Original Diggers and the Onslow Company. The whole nobody wrote down. The longest treasure hunt in the world was started by 3 people with shovels, and they quit at 30 feet because they got scared. According to the accounts, in the summer of 1795, a young man named Daniel McGinnis found a circular depression on the eastern end of the island. He was looking for farmland. What he found instead lined up with a story everyone in Mahone Bay had heard about a dying member of Captain Kidd's crew who claimed 2 million pounds were buried along this coast. McGinnis came back with 2 men recorded only as John Smith and Anthony Vaughan, and they started digging. 2 feet down, a layer of flagstones. Below that, the earth was noticeably looser than the ground around it, and there were tool marks on the walls, pick scrapes, as if someone had cut this shaft and filled it back in. The earliest accounts describe marks at 10-foot intervals, the oak platforms every 10 feet. The detail everybody repeats only appears in retellings written decades later. They stopped at 30 feet. The reason given is superstitious dread. Around 1802, a group of investors from the Truro area returned as the Onslow Company, with money and men and equipment. They reached about 90 feet, reporting charcoal, putty, coconut fiber, and a large stone covered in symbols. Then, the pit flooded with 60 feet of water, and nobody could explain where it came from. They tried the standard mining answer, sinking a second shaft alongside and tunneling across underneath. The second shaft flooded too. Mather Desbrise's History of Lunenburg County also credits Samuel Ball, a black loyalist farmer living on the island, as a co-discoverer. Here is the problem that shaped everything afterward. The first published mention of any of this appeared in the Liverpool Transcript in 1857. 62 years after the fact. The first eyewitness account from Anthony Vaughan was printed in October 1862. No original document from the Onslow Company has ever been found. Not one. Nothing from this period is visible today. The shaft is gone, its location unknown. The ground around it dug and collapsed and redug for 200 years. Every man who came afterward was chasing a newspaper article, not a record. Number 9. William Chappell and Gilbert Hedden, the men who dug the wrong hole. By 1931, the money pit had a problem that money could not solve. Nobody knew where it was. 70 years of competing shafts, collapses, and backfill had turned the eastern end of the island into a field of holes. So, when a 1928 New York newspaper feature pulled 2 wealthy Americans into the story, both of them had to guess. William Chappell went first. He sank a shaft 12 feet by 14 down to 163 feet, positioned southwest of where he believed the 1897 shaft had been. And the 1897 shaft had only ever been assumed, without evidence, to sit near the original pit. A guess built on a guess. At 127 feet, he brought up an axe, a fluke anchor, and a pick, later identified as a Cornish miner's pick. By then, the ground held so much debris from earlier digs that nobody could say whose tools they were. Gilbert Hedden ran a steel fabricating company and came for the engineering problem rather than the gold. He bought the southeastern end of the island in 1935, hired a Scranton firm to pump and re-excavate the pit and the Chappelle shaft, and dug through 1935 and 1936. He also believed he had matched the island's stone features to a map printed in a British book about Captain Kidd, and sailed to England to ask the author about it. He found nothing. What he produced instead was correspondence. Hedden wrote to Franklin Roosevelt in September 1937. In 1939, he informed King George VI about developments on the island. When his own business troubles ended the search, a New York University professor took it over, and then the war ended that. The Chappelle shaft was swallowed by a later excavation. The 1930s sawmill foundations near Center Road are still there and still a stop on the tour. Two industrialists, a king, a president, and a hole that was in the wrong place the whole time. Number 8. The Old Gold Salvage and Wrecking Company, the future President's Hole. In August 1909, a 27-year-old New York law clerk arrived on Oak Island to help dig up pirate treasure. His name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was not the man in charge. That was Captain Henry L. Bowdoin, and Bowdoin was the first person to treat the money pit as an engineering contract rather than an adventure. He raised capital in New York, brought divers and modern drilling gear, and approached the flooding as a problem with a solution. Roosevelt was one of several society investors along for the story. His interest came down through his own family, from his grandfather Warren Delano Jr., who had put money into the island himself. The pit area was cleared to 113 feet. Divers went down. Borings were taken in and around the shaft. None of the cores held anything of interest. Bowdoin examined Smith's Cove and found the remains of an 1850 cofferdam and nothing else. Then he went to Halifax to look at the one piece of physical evidence everyone talked about: the famous inscribed stone from 90 feet down. Bowdoin described it as hard, fine-grained basalt, and it had no symbols on it at all. He was told the markings had worn away. He did not believe it because basalt does not wear like that. The company left the island in November. Bowdoin published a first-hand account in Collier's magazine in 1911, arguing that the whole thing was nonsense. It is the first time an insider went public against the legend, and it changed nothing at all. Roosevelt never let it go. He followed the story from inside the White House and quietly planned a detour to the island in 1939 while he was in Halifax. Fog and the drift toward war stopped him. He was still asking about the dig in 1945, the year he died. Nothing of the 1909 works survives above ground. The best debunk of Oak Island ever written was written by the man who ran the dig, and a president of the United States read it and kept believing anyway. Number 7. The Truro Company. The tide test. Someone eventually thought to check the water against a tide table. That is the entire significance of the Truro Company, and it is bigger than anything anyone found before or since. When they came back to the island in 1849, they were better funded and better organized than any group before them. And one of the men helping to put the company together was Anthony Vaughan, one of the three from 1795, now an old man. It is the only expedition with a living link back to the beginning. They re-excavated the pit to 86 feet, where it flooded again. So they stopped digging blind and drilled instead. 5 boreholes with a pod auger. The drill passed through a spruce platform at 98 feet, then oak, then something the crew described only as metal in pieces, then another spruce layer, then clay for 7 feet. They struck that platform twice, and each time metal came up with wood and coconut fiber. Those few minutes of drilling are the origin of the entire chests in a vault idea that has driven the search ever since. Then they sank a new shaft 109 feet deep, northwest of the original, and tunneled toward the target. It flooded, and they watched the water level in that brand new shaft rise and fall in time with the ocean. That is the moment. That is when it stopped being a treasure hunt with a drainage problem and became something else entirely. Water on a tide cycle means you are not pumping out a puddle. You are pumping out the Atlantic. They put the rest of their money into Smith's Cove, looking for the source. They found what they identified as a flood tunnel system and coconut fiber buried beneath the beach itself, which produced the theory that the beach had been engineered into a siphon. A sample of that fiber was later sent to the Smithsonian, which confirmed it was coconut. Coconuts do not grow in Nova Scotia. They could not shut the water off. A final shaft went down 118 feet, and during that work, the bottom of the original pit collapsed. In 1851, the company ran out of money and dissolved. Smith's Cove has been dug up many times since, and the drains they found are still argued over. One modern analysis says they are the remains of an early salt works with no connection to the flooding at all. Nobody has ever pumped the money pit dry, because for 170 years, everybody has been fighting the ocean and losing on schedule, twice a day. Number 6. The Oak Island Treasure Company, the day the crew refused to go back down. On the 26th of March, 1897, a worker named Maynard Kaiser finished checking a pump at the bottom of a shaft beside the money pit and signaled to be brought up. Partway to the surface, the rope slipped off the hoist. He fell and he died. He was the second man killed in the search. What happened next had never happened before. Men who had gone down that shaft every working day of their lives stopped going down it. Several of them had become convinced the treasure was cursed or guarded, and they would not descend. For the first time in 100 years, work on Oak Island stopped because of fear, rather than water or money. The company running the site was a share-issuing venture led by Frederick Blair, and share-issuing ventures need results to publish. That same year, it produced the two most famous pieces of evidence in the entire story. A drill was reported to have struck a cement-walled vault at around 155 feet. And a boring sample was claimed to have brought up a scrap of sheepskin parchment carrying two letters in India ink, V or possibly Y. Both claims funded another generation of digging. Neither has ever been independently confirmed. The vault has never been relocated. Bear in mind who was making the claims and what they were selling. In 1898, the company poured red dye into the flooded pit, and it reportedly emerged at 3 separate points around the island. In 1897, Captain John Welling found the stone triangle on the shore, an equilateral arrangement of stones with a semicircular feature whose medial line pointed toward the money pit. The pumps could not hold back the water. The funding thinned. But Blair held the search rights and the money pit lease for decades afterward, into the 1930s, which makes him the longest-serving figure of the whole pre-modern era. The Stone Triangle site is on the island tour today. The curse, the story that 7 men must die before the treasure is found, hardens into local folklore from roughly this point onward. It did not come from a document or a legend. It came from watching a man fall. If you are finding this one interesting, drop a thumbs up and tell us in the comments which of these expeditions you would have joined. We read everyone. We are halfway down the list now, and the 4 ahead of us are the ones where the island stops taking money and starts taking something else. Number 5. Oak Island Tours, everything money can buy. Carbon dating, dendrochronology, X-ray fluorescence, lead isotope analysis, laser ablation, muon tomography, seismic surveying, industrial steel caissons driven into the ground to allow excavation below the water table for the first time in the island's history. That is the current search. It has more money, more science, and more equipment than every previous expedition put together. And after 20 years, it still cannot answer the question the Truro Company failed to answer in 1849. It began with a boy and a magazine. Rick Lagina read a Reader's Digest article about Oak Island as a child and never let go of it. 40 years later, with his brother Marty's money from an energy business behind him, he bought his way onto the island. In April 2006, it was announced that the Lagina brothers of Michigan had purchased 50% of Oak Island tours from David Tobias. A year earlier, members of the same Michigan group had bought Lot 25 for a reported $230,000, the province noticed. A treasure trove license was granted in 2010, then repealed and replaced by the Oak Island Treasure Act, effective the 1st of January 2011, which requires a license from the Minister of Natural Resources to dig at all. Since 2014, the whole operation has been filmed. Season 13 ended in May 2026, and 25 more episodes were announced for November. And it has genuinely produced something no previous expedition ever managed. For 2 centuries, this was a story propped up by other stories. Now there are carbon dates, dated timbers, metallurgy, laboratory results. There is a real evidentiary record establishing that people were on this island doing something long before 1795. On Lot 8, the team lifted a 40,000-pound boulder and found a man-made stone platform underneath it. What none of it establishes is what is at the bottom of the money pit, or whether anything is. Here is the detail that stops people cold. The Reader's Digest article that hooked an 11-year-old Rick Lagina was published in January 1965. 7 months later, that same island killed 4 men, including a father and his 18-year-old son. A copy of that article now hangs on the wall of the room where he films. The island reopened to the public in 2026 after 6 years closed. Guided tours run from the interpretive center, and demand has repeatedly outstripped capacity. 13 seasons, every instrument modern science can point at a hole in the ground. And the central question sits exactly where a bankrupt Victorian company left it. Number 4. The Oak Island Association. The day the pit ate itself. In 1861, the bottom of the money pit fell out. This was the most ambitious operation of the 19th century. A proper joint stock association with a superintendent, a workforce and steam plant, formed on the 3rd of April 1861. Their plan was to attack from every direction at once. Reopen the original pit, sink parallel shafts, tunnel across underneath it, and simultaneously seal the flood tunnels down at the beach. They re-excavated the original to 88 feet and dug 2 more shafts. One missed its target entirely. The other intersected the original via a tunnel at around 105 feet. Both filled with water the moment a flood tunnel was breached, and they had hollowed out the ground beneath the pit. A platform inside the original shaft at 98 feet gave way and dropped. The 2 platforms below it went with it. Whatever the shaft contained fell to roughly 119 feet and came to rest under an estimated 10,000 board feet of collapsing lumber. Read that number again. 10,000 board feet of timber on top of the thing everyone was looking for. The disasters kept coming. Late in 1861, a pump engine boiler burst, throwing boiling water across the work site. Several laborers were badly scalded, and one of them died. That man is the first recorded death in the search for the Oak Island treasure. Nobody wrote his name down. The explosion itself was first mentioned in a travel book published in 1863, called Rambles Among the Blue Noses. The detail that someone had died only appeared in print 5 years later. We know a man was killed at all because of a passing line in somebody's holiday memoir. They kept going. In early 1862, a shaft 107 feet deep let them pump the original down to 103 feet, and the pumps still could not keep up. What they did recover were tools left behind by the Onslow and Truro companies, which is the earliest physical confirmation that those companies existed at all. At Smith's Cove, they drilled and built barriers to shut off the flood tunnels, and the tide broke through every single one. A last attempt in 1864 breached the flood system again. By then, saltwater was undermining the walls of the original shaft. Workers refused to enter it. Mining engineers inspected it and declared it unsafe. The money ran out, and the association was finished by March 1865. Nothing from any of this is visible on the island today. Every expedition since 1861 has been digging through the wreckage of one afternoon, and none of them have ever been sure which layer of ruin belongs to whom. Number 3. Triton Alliance and Borehole 10-X, 50 years in one hole. There is a steel pipe in the ground about 180 feet northeast of the money pit. It has been there since 1971. A man gave the rest of his life to what he believed was at the bottom of it. Dan Blankenship read about Oak Island in Reader's Digest, came north from Florida to invest, and never left. In January 1967, he formed a syndicate with David Tobias, Robert Dunfield, and Fred Nolan. 2 years later, Blankenship and Tobias bought most of the island and formed Triton Alliance. They brought real engineering discipline to the problem for the first time, and they sank a 235-foot shaft supported by a steel caisson driven to bedrock. The location had been chosen by dowsing. Drilling turned up cavities at 140 feet and at 235. So they lowered a camera into the void. According to Blankenship and Tobias, what came back showed possible chests, wooden cribbing, tools, and human remains. Blankenship said he saw a severed hand. Those few minutes of footage became the most argued over tape in treasure hunting history. The images were murky, and nothing on them has ever been independently confirmed. He dived into the flooded chamber himself, more than once, and could never relocate anything he had seen. The shaft nearly killed him. In November 1976, he was lowered into 10X on a winch, and the casing began collapsing around him underground. He got out. In 1978, he and his son and Dan Henske went back and re-excavated the whole thing, stabilizing it with improvised casing cut from railway tank cars. Meanwhile, the operation was tearing itself apart. Triton sued Fred Nolan in 1983 over 7 island lots and access across the causeway. Nolan's ownership was confirmed in 1985, though he was ordered to pay damages, and Triton lost again on appeal in 1989. Through the 1990s, the search stalled entirely on litigation between the partners and a lack of money. The shaft was eventually redug to 181 feet, reaching bedrock and abandoned. And here is the wild part. In 1995, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution ran a 2-week survey of the island. It is the only scientific study ever conducted on the site. They ran dye tests, and they concluded that the flooding is not caused by a man-made tunnel at all. It is the island's own freshwater lens, meeting tidal pressure in the limestone underneath. The famous booby trap, the engineered flood system, the thing that had defeated 8 generations of searchers, is the island being an island. The same scientists looked at Blankenship's 1971 footage and reported that nothing conclusive could be determined from it. Divers reached the bottom of Borehole 10-X in 2016 and found no artifacts. Everybody kept digging anyway. That is not a criticism. That is the whole story of this island in one sentence. Number 2. Robert Dunfield, the man who erased the address. In August 1965, a barge crossed 200 meters of water, carrying a Caterpillar bulldozer. 2 months later, a causeway was finished from Crandall's Point on the mainland to the western end of the island, purpose-built, so that a 70-ton crane could be driven across. Robert Dunfield was a petroleum geologist from Canoga Park, California. His logic was not stupid, and it is worth understanding before we get to what he did. Every expedition for 170 years had failed the same way. Go down a narrow shaft, hit water, lose. So Dunfield proposed skipping the shaft entirely, remove the entire hillside, sift every bucket of spoil for artifacts, expose whatever was down there from above in daylight, with nowhere for it to hide. He had the geological training to think it through and the equipment budget to attempt it. He leased portions of the island and went to work with a 70-ton digging crane and a clam bucket. He excavated the pit area to a depth of 134 feet and a width of 100 feet, an open pit mine on a 140-acre island. Slick, gray mud, spoil heaps, tracked machinery running through a Nova Scotia winter. He found nothing worth keeping. He also wrote that he examined the walls of the re-excavated pit carefully and could not locate any evidence of a flood tunnel anywhere in them. When his lease ran out in August 1966, he ordered the crater filled back in, and that is the moment the Oak Island treasure hunt lost the Oak Island treasure hunt, because what Dunfield left behind was a site with no reference points. The original shaft, the Onslow shafts, the Truro shafts, the 1861 tunnels, Chappelle's 163-foot hole, all of it churned into a single mass of undifferentiated fill and pushed back into the ground. As a direct consequence of that excavation, the location of the original money pit shaft is no longer precisely known. Every searcher since has been guessing at an address. There is one more thing about Dunfield, and it sits oddly against the rest of it. In July 1965, he had bought into the operation of the man already working the island, $5,000, and according to family accounts, he demanded and received control of the whole thing. His first bulldozer landed on the beach on the 3rd of August. 2 weeks later, 4 men died. The causeway he built is still there. It carries the tour buses. It is the only genuinely useful thing anyone has ever constructed on Oak Island. And it was built by the man who destroyed the evidence. Number 1. The Restall expedition, the 27-foot shaft. Walk down to Smith's Cove on a warm August afternoon, and there is not much to look at. Cobble and sand, a slope of drumlin rising behind you, spruce at the tree line. The tide is out. Water drags back through the stones with that hollow sucking noise beaches make. Up in the trees behind the beach, there are 2 shacks with washing outside, because a family lives here, and near the tide line, there is a hole in the ground. 27 feet deep, small, ordinary, timbered at the mouth. Nothing like the great engineered pits up the hill with their steel and their steam plant, and their 160-foot shafts. That is the deadliest hole on Oak Island. A pump is running down there. The air is still and warm, which is exactly the condition that lets gas pool at the bottom of a shaft where nothing moves it. Robert Restall had been a motorcycle daredevil. He and his wife Mildred rode the wall of a globe of death, touring Canada and beyond. In 1959, he signed a contract with one of the island's property owners, moved his family onto Oak Island, and started digging. He had no crane and no caisson, and no investors worth the name. What he had was time and an idea. The answer was not in the money pit at all. The answer was in the water feeding it. Find the flood system at Smith's Cove, cut the supply, and everything else follows. So he worked it by hand, season after season, for 6 years, while the money slowly ran out. In the summer of 1965, he finally took on an investor, a Californian who wanted to bulldoze the place. On the 17th of August, Restall climbed down the shaft to check the pump and was overcome by gas. Most accounts identify it as naturally occurring hydrogen sulfide, though some earlier ones blame carbon monoxide from the pump itself. He fell into the water at the bottom. His son Bobby, 18 years old, saw him go down and went in after him. He lost consciousness too. Carl Grazer went in. Then Cyril Hiltz, who was 16. Then Andy DeMont. It took minutes. The man who ended it was not on the crew. Edward White was a visitor to the site. He worked out what was down there, tied a rope around his own waist, had himself lowered into the shaft, and came back up with Andy DeMont. He is the reason it was 4 dead and not 5. Robert Restall, his son, Carl Grazer, and Cyril Hiltz all died that afternoon. It brought the island's recorded death toll to 6, and it remains the worst single incident in the entire history of the search. 7 months earlier, Reader's Digest had run a cheerful feature about the family's excavation. Smith's Cove is inside the active dig area now, and it has been excavated many times since. The curse says 7 must die before the treasure is found. 6 have, and 4 of them went into that hole on the same afternoon, one after another, each one knowing what had happened to the man before him and climbing down anyway. 200 meters off the Nova Scotia coast, On 140 acres of spruce and clay, 10 expeditions in more than 2 centuries have produced no confirmed treasure and 6 graves. For me, it is Dunfield. He is the only one who might actually have solved it by brute force, and the thing he destroyed on the way was the map back to the beginning. Which of these would you have joined, and which one do you think came closest? If this kind of forgotten history is what you are here for, subscribe.